thank you for the invitation to present in this meeting. So, as Sebastián said, I'm going to start in this paper. I'm going to present results of pension reform in Argentina and how this changed the situation of women within the household, and it's a joint work with two co-authors that are in Spain. As you may know, processes that and decisions that occur inside the household affect allocation and socioeconomic outcomes of the family members. In the recent decades, many countries have been implementing programs to fight poverty, but by transferring resources to the household, they may be changing the within-household distribution of income and the relative income of spouses. As I told you, I'm going to study pension reform, non-contributory pension reform in Argentina, and although this reform was not strictly affecting women, it mostly affect them because due to lower attachment to the labor market, so women, I will show you some pictures, were the main affected by this reform. So what we are going to do here is to focus on these senior women, and we are going to ask whether this relatively small transfer in their income but permanently affect their situation within the household in terms of their marital stability and other measures that will relate them to their bargaining power within the house. So specifically in this paper, we exploit a reform. It was partially a non-contributory pension reform, but for the cohort that we are going to analyze, actually it worked as a non-contributory pension reform, and it was also informally known as the housewife pension reform, and we will use it as an exogenous change in their incomes, and we will implement the difference in different strategy to look which were the impacts on the following outcomes: the probability of being divorced or separated, and other measures that will relate to their bargaining power within the household. So these measures are quite limited for data availability. So these two measures that we think are related to their bargaining power are the probability of being the head of the household and some measures of how housework is divided among family members. So fast preview of the result, we find that this reform, this transfer of resources to these senior women increased the probability of divorce and also affected their bargaining power within the household. I will tell you the particular details of the reform, but let me start first with important facts that shows why we think that this a setting where we can analyze these asymmetric shocks within the household. So as I said, the reform, the aim of the reform was to increase pension coverage among individuals that qualify for, because of their age, they qualify for a pension, but they couldn't access due to they haven't contributed to the social security. Particularly women, due to their low attachment to the labor market, had a low coverage of pensions, about 55%, and the reform, which was fully implemented in 2007, affected over 1 million women in Argentina and around 500,000 men. This program implied about 2.4% of the GDP. So as I told you in terms of coverage, so here in the right graph you have time. Here, this is 2007 when this reform was fully implemented, and here you have the percentage of individuals of retirement age that actually have a pension. So the red line is for women and the brown line is for men, and you can see that for women coverage rises from 55% to almost 80%. The reform also affected men, but it had a great impact for women. If we exclude widows in our sample, because widows can have pension due to their widowhood, so if we exclude widows, we see that the impact was much greater. So this is the first fact. The second fact is that this reform have an important effect for those women that at the age of 60, which is the retirement age in Argentina, did not have any personal income. So here, in this graph, for instance, you have age of women. 60 is the retirement age. And here you have the percentage of women without any personal income. See? So what we can see, the green line is the percentage of women without any personal income in the pre-reform period, where more or less 50% for any age between 55 and 70. But after the reform, the red line shows us that after 60, there is an important drop in the probability of not having any personal income. For men, which the retirement age is 65, we do not observe this large drop in the probability of not having any personal income. So the reform was important to give some money to women that otherwise would have gone without any personal income. So this paper is related to at least 3 strands of literature. The first one is the decision and allocation literature, the literature of allocation of resources within the household, where, for instance, bargaining models says that if one family member receives an income shock, then he should there should be a reallocation of resources toward the consumption that these family members benefits the more. So in terms of our framework, we think that an income shocks to these women may have increased in the terms of the outcomes that we are going to analyze, the probability of being the head of the household, if this reflects, of course, their bargaining power and their well-being, and a more equitable distribution of household chores. The other strand of literature is the literature that studies the determinant of divorce. This literature predicted that as the gains from marriage decreases, so divorces should increase. The sociologists put forth the hypothesis that states that if the women receive more income, they should divorce more. In this sense, our results are in line with this literature. And the other strand of literature is that looks the effect of other pension reform. There are some papers looking the same reform, but mainly on labor force participation decisions and outcomes of other family members. We are going to focus on women. So what's the institutional setting in Argentina? The retirement age, as I told you, is 60 for women and 65 for men. And the other requirement to get a pension is to contribute to the Social Security during 30 years. So if you turn 60 but you don't meet the years of contribution, you cannot get a pension. So the reform changed that, the second requirement. So in terms of divorce of separation, that is one of the outcomes we are going to look at. So in Argentina, there is no unilateral divorce, which makes divorce a little bit costly. And of course, probability of divorce is low among the elderly. So a priori, one may think that maybe we are not going to find any effect. So we have some, for instance, we compare probability of divorce between 60 and 65 in Argentina from data, from census data, let's say. And we found that the probability of getting a divorce at those ages is 0.7%, similar to the US. What were the details of this reform? So there was a law in December of 2004 that stated that all cohorts born 1944 and earlier, that is all those, from the point of view of women, all those women that already have 60 by 2004 were allowed to receive a pension without ever, if they don't contribute to the Social Security, they were allowed to receive a pension. So this was actually, the name of the reform was a moratorium, because people could claim a debt with the government that they failed to contribute some years. Of these 30 years they have to contribute, but for this particular cohort, they could claim 30 years of missing contribution. And this debt was included in a moratorium, but women could start receiving a pension net of that debt. There was a cap on the pension received, that so every woman should receive at least 51% of the minimum pension. How much money was the transfer to these women? According to our calculation in US dollars PVP, more or less a woman with the discount would get the first 5 years around $190, and afterwards $374. The period of enrollment to get this into this moratorium initially was until April 2007, but there is a second law that extended enrollment period permanently. So the year of full implementation is, as you saw in the data, was 2007. So one concern that we have is what happened between the date in which the law was approved and 2007, because we may have concerns of anticipation effects on receiving this money. So we looked, for instance, at media data to look how was the media coverage of this reform. We look into the two major newspapers in Argentina, and using some phrases, we look how many news were covering this reform. What we see is that to know if it was public knowledge before 2007 or not. We see that this is the December 2004 when the law was approved, but then we don't see much coverage of the reform until more or less the middle of 2006, because actually the reform was regulated in 2006. So until 2006, nobody was receiving the money. The data I'm going to use is data from the Argentinian Continuous Permanent Household Survey. This is a quarterly survey. This is a rotating panel. The main results I'm going to show you are based on, we use the survey as repeated cross-sections. It covers urban regions. It has a household questionnaire and an individual questionnaire, and we are going to use years between 2004 and 2009. And we have, from the survey, several information about income sources, but we don't really know if these women were receiving or not the pension through the moratorium. So what we are going to identify are intention to treat effects. The outcomes we construct from the survey are the following: the probability of being divorced or separated. We cannot distinguish between the two. So this is how the data is reported. Then we are going to construct a dummy where the woman is the head of the household. And related to housework activities in this household survey, the household is asked who is doing most of the housework, and also they ask who other family member helps in housework activities. So this is information we have in the survey. So from this information we construct the following outcomes. The first one is whether the wife is the only one responsible for most of the housework. So we check if that nobody else is helping in housework activities. This is one outcome. The other outcome is whether the husband is in charge of most of the housework, but we don't restrict this to be the only one, because in general this doesn't happen. So we consider them if he's doing most of the housework, maybe with the help of other family members. And then the third outcome is whether the husband contribute to some housework activities, not being the main responsible of these activities. And also we check if in the household there is domestic services, because we would like to know if there are some substitution of activities, not necessarily towards the husband, but towards an external help. Our identification strategy is a difference in different strategy. We define as the pre-treatment period the years between 2004 and 2006, post-treatment period 2007 and 2009. Treated group are the cohort of women between 1941 and 1944. Remember, these are the cohorts that when the policy, this reform was implemented, they could benefit for the maximum benefit that this moratorium allowed, that is to have a debt of 30 years of contribution. As our control group, we consider cohort of women born between 1950 and 1953. So basically the idea is to have in our control group women that already turned 60 in the pre-treatment period. So we don't want to capture any change in behavior from when people is turning 59 to 60, because there are some women that actually would get the pension anyway. And in our control group, we have women that in the whole sample period, they never turn 60. So basically, we implement a simple difference in different strategy, where beta is going to capture the intention to treat effect of the program. And we control for cohort and quarter year dummies, and in some specification we include some characteristics of the women. So in what rest of the presentation, I'm going to show you first the effect of the reform on income, to show that it was in fact an income effect there. Then the effects on divorce and separation, and these measures of women's bargaining power. And if I have time, I'm going to show you some placebos using pre-reform treatment data and extensions, where we look at heterogeneous effect by education level of women, and also we exploit a little bit the panel dimension of the survey. So first, the effects of the reform on income. So the first two columns, you have the probability of receiving a pension. Yeah? The first column, we have the whole sample, and the results show us that the reform increased in 43 percentage points the probability of receiving a pension. This implied about 145 percentage change. Then we consider a sample where we only restrict to women that are divorced or married. We don't want, afterwards, if we are going to look at effects on divorce, we don't want to have widows or single women. And also, we see a very important impact on the probability of receiving a pension of 53 percentage points. In terms of the probability of not having any personal income, the reform reduced this probability in about, depending on the sample we consider, in about 26 to 36 percentage points, which implied a reduction of about 70 percentage. And finally, in terms of income, where it is transformed to dollars PPP, the reform increased the income of the treated women in about between $65 and $69. Going to the sample of only married women, we see that a similar effect. So in the probability of receiving a pension, there is an increase in 44 percentage points. The probability of not having any personal income, only for married women, decreases almost 40 percentage points. 71 increase in their personal income on average. And in terms of the share of women's income within the household, so remember these are only married women, we see that in terms of the income of the household, the share of women income increases in about 10 percentage points, which represent about 56% increase. And in terms of the income of the couple, almost the same, 11 percentage points, 51% increase. Going to the effects on divorce and separation, here we have again results for the whole sample. So we know there are many women that are widows and single, but we include them there anyway. And then the sample for divorced and married. What we find is that the reform increased in about 2 to 2.7 percentage point the probability of being divorced or separated, representing a percentage change relative to the mean of about 20%. So these are our exactly. Yeah, this is the first sample is all the individuals that were affected by the reform, but then we know there are many women there that are not really affected in this dimension, the probability of being divorced. So the second column, we restrict the sample to divorced and married women. In terms of the probability of being the head of the household, we find that for the whole sample, there is an increase of about 3 percentage points in both cases. And on this other outcome, on the probability of being the woman is the only responsible for housework, there is a reduction of about 1.2 and 2.4 percentage points. Head of the household, we have in the survey, we have an identification of which is the member that is is reported to be the head of the household. The limitation that we have there is that we don't really know who is reporting that. But this is the information that we observe in the survey.
But what is the concept? Is the member of the family who makes more money than others, maybe?
Exactly. Well, the literature in general recognizes mainly the sociology literature that in general there is a bias that the one that is the head of the household is the one that earns more money. So to the extent that we believe that this is a measure of somehow the bargaining power of the individuals within the household, so we think that this may be reflecting that. If the women gain more money, maybe she's gaining some bargaining power, and then she's the one that is reported to be the head of the household. Or mainly it's only reflecting that she has more income, and it has nothing to do with bargaining power. Yes. Among men. So yeah, this is exactly because here, if there is an increase in divorces, then we can automatically have an increase in the probability of being the head of the household because you are now separated or divorced. So this is what we do next, to look only married women. Okay. So the first column we have whether the wife, now we have only married couple, where the wife is the head of the household, and we find that the reform increases this probability in 1.5 percentage points, representing about 20% increase. Among married women, we also look whether the wife is the only responsible for housework, and we find that the reform decreased this probability in about 5 percentage points, represented a decrease in 11%. And then we look, well, if the wife is doing less or has less responsibility, if anybody else taking care of that, we don't find any effects on the probability of having domestic service, that then if there is an income effect, maybe they are using this extra money to have external help. We don't find any effect. And then we look whether the husband is helping more. And even though the sign is positive, we don't find any significant effect there. Then we do some extensions. We do some placebo analysis, because here, remember that we have in our treatment and control groups women that are different ages. So we cannot really control for age effects. So if the evolution of these outcomes only changes differently because we have different age groups in the treatment and control group, maybe we are finding effects due to that. So to discard that this may be driving our results, we analyze similar age groups in another time periods and see what happened, and we don't find any effect there. Then we look at the heterogeneous impact of the reform by educational level of women, dividing them in two groups, high educated and low educated. High educated women are those who have finished high school or more education. And finally, we exploit the panel dimension of our data to see whether we find short-run effects of the program, because the panel dimension of this survey is relatively short. We can follow women for one year plus a quarter. So going to the placebos, we construct treatment and control groups composed by women of the same ages as the ages that we actually have in our treatment and control groups. These are placebo treatment and placebo control groups. The same ages, but we have to go to a pre-treatment period that we choose a placebo pre-treatment period from 1996 to 1998, and then a placebo post-treatment period from 1999 and 2001. And we run the same regressions. The only problem that we have is that we cannot check the placebo effects over the distribution of housework activities, because those questions were not in the surveys those years. So we check the probability, first if there are income effects, differential income evolution for these two age groups, and the probability of being divorced and the probability of being the head of the household. So using this placebo pre-treatment and post-treatment period, we find that there are no income effects, so there are between these two groups, there are no differential evolution of income. We only find a small effect on the probability of receiving a pension of 4 percentage points, but during the pension reform period, we are finding that the probability of receiving a pension increases about 40 percentage points for the treatment group. And we don't find effects on divorce or separations or being the head of the household. And if anything, we are finding that the probability of these senior women being the head of the household decreases in this placebo analysis. Then we analyze whether there are heterogeneous impacts by educational level. Maybe, so depending on the education may indicate what was the bargaining power of women in the before receiving this extra money. So maybe we can expect differential effects by education. And also want to check whether there was heterogeneity in the impact of the reform on women of different levels of education. What we find is that women, the low educated women, so women that did not finish, that have less than a high school degree, are more affected by this reform, as one expects, but also high educated women are were affected as well. I will show you. So the impact of the reform in terms of income. So in the first row you have what we call low educated women, and in the second you have the result for high educated women. So in the probability of receiving a pension, the first column we have the sample of all women, and in the second column we have the sample of divorced and married women. And we can see that the probability of receiving a pension increases much more for the low educated than for the high educated, but still high educated women were affected strongly.
And you did separate regressions.
And we did separate regression. It's not that we are only interacting the treatment post dummy. We separated the samples and run the regressions. The probability of not having any personal income, again, the effect is larger for low educated women, so there is a 30 percentage point decrease, or 40 depending on the sample we consider, while there is about 20-25 percentage decrease for the high educated women. And in terms of the impact on their personal income, for the low educated, the reform implied on average an increase between $82 to $92, and for the high between $52 and $75. And then when looking at the outcomes on divorce, probability of being head of the household, and this on the distribution of housework activities, what we find is a particular pattern. So the effect of the reform on divorces are mainly driven by the effect on the high educated women. We don't find effects on divorce for the low educated women. And then the effects for, and also, well, the probability of being head of the household, the impact is on high educated women. But the effect of the reform reducing the probability that the wife is the only responsible of housework activities comes mainly through the low educated. This is the pattern that we find. So for all women, as I said, the effects on the probability of the reform on the probability of being divorced or separated, we don't find any effect for the low educated women in both samples. And the effect comes mainly through the effects on the high educated. Of course, again, here looking at the probability of being the head of the household makes not much sense, maybe because here maybe this is increasing due to the fact that women are separating more. So then we look at the effects for married women. And for married women, what we find in the probability of being head of the household, even though that the coefficients are positive, the results are not more statistically significant when we open by educational groups. The probability that the wife is the only responsible for housework only is reduced for low educated women. We don't find any effect on the high educated women. And then we don't find any effect on the probability of having domestic service, external help in housework activities, nor on the probability that the husband is helping with them.
These domestic services that someone that lives in the house, right? It's not so, maybe there is someone who fight for 2 hours.
We have both, no? They ask whether they have domestic services that maybe is understood like that, or external help. But it's another member. It's not a family member who is doing the work. So, to conclude, we find that there is the reform implied a substantial effect on these women's. For instance, as I said, the share of income for married women increased. The share of income in the couple increased about 50 to 55%. And we find that there are some effects on the situation of women in the household. Divorce and separation probabilities increases, mainly driven by high educated women. Of course, one may think that this is only a short, medium run effect, because this increase in divorces or separation maybe reflects a backlog, that there were many women that had any source of personal income, and if they want to separate, they could not afford that. And also, if you believe me, if you think that these measures reflects really the bargaining power of women, what we are finding is that the reform increased their bargaining power within the household by increasing their probability of being the head of the household and reducing their activities for household activities.
I really like reading this paper. The paper is very well crafted, covering as many bases as the data allows. There is a careful definition of the selection and of the treatment and cohort samples. This is very nice. And there is also a very careful selection of the survey years that will allow the identification of the effects in the pre and post reform periods. So there is a nice handling of samples according to marital status. However, I think marital status could be affected in the post period, so any thoughts on how this composition may affect the results might be helpful for the reader. There is a nice definition of the outcomes given limitations in the data. And there is also a nice handling of heterogeneity of the impacts over these outcomes. As you mentioned, you did this by splitting the sample between low and high educated women, and but I think it would be good to try the interactions, because with the interactions you are not changing the other coefficients. So keeping other coefficients fixed, you can see whether there is any change in the beta that you are aiming to estimate. As the authors recognize, they are unable to verify the number of years of contributions to the Social Security Fund, and also there is no possibility to check whether there is access to the payment scheme introduced by the reform. So they acknowledge they are estimating an intention to treat instead of a treatment on the treated effect, which is nice to put that in front. But maybe a discussion on whether treatment on the treated is going to be high or low could be explicitly in the paper, could be nice too. There is also a nice discussion on the anticipation of benefits in the control cohorts, which suggests that there might be some downward bias in the estimation, which also is nice to be acknowledged in front of the estimation. And there is a good testing for common pre-treatment trends among treated and control cohorts, which is also nice. They verify similar trends for treated and control cohorts in outcomes during the pre-reform period, which reassures the identification strategy implemented in the paper. There is also a nice handling of placebo effects. Here I also suggest you keep age fixed when you do the placebo effects. Maybe it will be nice to check whether if you keep the cohort fixed, you find that the placebo are actually zero. So that's a minor thing. Some specific comments regarding the pension and the treatment group status. I'm not familiar with the survey, but I would like to know what is the specific question regarding access to pensions in the survey, because most surveys in Latin America ask for affiliation to a pension fund instead of actual receipt of a payment. So it would be nice to... It's actual receipt of the payment. Okay. Nice. There is also a question regarding whether this is voluntary or mandatory. The law established that you have access to the pension, but there is no explicit discussion on whether you are mandated to receive it. Where do you receive a check at your home, where you have to go to register at any office. It would also be nice to know how the bureaucracy of the reform is enacted, in order to see whether there are some barriers to access that can affect the composition of the sample which is actually treated. Another thing that would be interesting is to discuss about the geographic heterogeneity, if it exists on the service. So there might be areas which full coverage because there is a bank office or because there is a social security office, but some other areas could have some limitations in terms of actual supply of the service, so this could be nice to have in the discussion. Some specific questions or comments regarding the definition of marital status. I'm not sure whether marital status is defined as ever married, as always single. That kind of stuff would be very useful to have in order to see whether this is going to in terms of the effects. Regarding the estimation, one question is whether the structure of the survey or if there is any specific sampling design of the survey, where you need weights, sampling weights, where this will affect the estimation of the point coefficient, and whether there is a specific sampling design, in which case you will need that in order to get precise standard error estimations. So that is not, at least in the version that I have access to, that is not explicit in the paper, so it will be nice to hear about that. In that case, you will have to include a primary or secondary sampling unit in order to get a correct estimation of the standard error and the cluster units or the blocking units in case the design is of that kind. Another thing that I think is important to discuss is the structure of the survey. The paper claims that since 2003, the survey have a panel component. So households enter the survey for, I guess, 6 quarters, and they are visited the first 2 and the last 2. So this, the specific question is whether you are using all the observation regardless of whether you are a panel unit or not. Because if you are using all of these observations, you are introducing some serial correlation that might affect the standard errors, and it would be nice to hear how you handle that serial correlation in the error in the equation. It would also be nice, you put it in the presentation, that it would also be nice to have the mean of the outcome variable in all the tables, so you can have the effect size instead of just the percentage point. You can see whether the magnitude or the size of the effect is actually okay. Probably not in the version that I have access to. One thing that also is different in the paper than in the presentation, maybe it's only a matter of labels, is that the effect on the share of the income of women in the couple or in the household income has the reverse order. So I was curious about that. Maybe it's a change in the labels. Finally, in table 14, the version of the paper that I read, I was wondering whether it's possible to exclude separate never married women in the sample, because at the time of the survey you can be single, but that doesn't mean that you were never married. So I think it's going to be nice if you could, if you can, at least discuss that what kind of marital status you are handling with. Okay. So that's it. Very nice paper. Thank you very much.